Ethan Carter learned early that in his family, love always came with conditions. At Sunday dinners, achievements were served beside the mashed potatoes, and failures sat heavier than the roast on the table. His older brother, Daniel, was the golden child, a polished corporate lawyer who drove a silver Mercedes and wore confidence like expensive cologne. His younger sister, Vanessa, married a heart surgeon before turning 30 and spent most family dinners talking about vacation homes and private schools. Then there was Ethan, the creative one. That was the polite version. The real version came after wine glasses were half empty and his mother forgot to soften her voice. Still doing those little computer drawings, she would ask, or worse, when are you going to get a real career? At 30, too, Ethan worked as a freelance graphic designer and branding consultant. He owned a tiny studio apartment, drove a 10-year-old Honda with peeling paint on the hood, and spent more nights worrying about invoices than sleeping peacefully. But what his family never understood was that Ethan loved what he did. He loved turning ideas into identities. He loved watching blank screens become elegant designs that made businesses feel alive. To Ethan, creativity wasn't childish. It was survival. It was the only place he ever felt respected. Unfortunately, respect didn't exist at the Carter dinner table. Daniel just closed another 7-figure case, his father announced proudly one Sunday evening. Daniel smirked while cutting into his steak. Hard work pays off, Vanessa smiled sweetly. Ethan works hard too. Before Ethan could appreciate the rare defense, she added, just not profitably. The table erupted in laughter. Even his mother covered her mouth, pretending the joke was harmless. Ethan forced a smile and stared down at his plate. He was used to this, that was the saddest part. What exactly do you do again? Daniel asked loudly. Make wedding invitations. I build brand identities. Ethan answered calmly. Oh, right, Daniel said. Fancy way of saying logos. Their father chuckled. Your brother spent 7 years becoming a lawyer. You spent 7 years picking fonts. Ethan swallowed hard. Every dinner felt like standing in front of a firing squad armed with sarcasm. Still, he kept showing up. Part of him hoped maybe one day they'd finally see him differently. But people only see what they want to see. 2 days later, Ethan sat in his cramped apartment, staring at his laptop, while rain tapped against the windows. Bills were stacked beside him like little threats. Rent was due in 10 days. One client payment was already late. Then his phone rang. Hello. Is this Ethan Carter Design? Yes. My name is Claire Beaumont. I got your information from the Delacroix Hotel project you did last year. Ethan sat up straighter. The Delacroix rebranding had been his biggest project so far. I'm getting married in 6 weeks, Claire continued. And my father wants the wedding to feel unforgettable, elegant, different. Someone showed us your work, and honestly, you're the first designer whose style didn't feel copied. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. A luxury wedding like this could change everything. By the end of the call, Ethan nearly dropped his phone. The contract was worth more money than he usually made in 8 months. For the first time in years, hope entered his apartment like sunlight. He worked nonstop after that. Days blurred into nights as Ethan designed custom invitations, digital experiences, animated displays, floral branding concepts, projection visuals, and elegant monograms that looked worthy of royalty. Every detail mattered. For once, someone trusted his vision completely, and Ethan refused to fail. The wedding was being hosted at the famous Beaumont estate, one of the most luxurious private properties in the state. The bride's father, Richard Beaumont, owned a global hospitality empire worth hundreds of millions. People like that didn't hire designers like Ethan, not usually, which made this opportunity terrifying. And important, unfortunately, his family found a way to ruin even this. At the next Sunday dinner, Ethan finally shared the news. I landed a major wedding contract, he said carefully. A pretty huge client, actually. Daniel barely looked up from his drink. How huge? The Beaumont family. Silence hit the table for half a second, then Daniel laughed. The Beaumonts hired you? Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Like billionaire Beaumonts, yes. His mother frowned suspiciously. Are you sure you're not exaggerating? I signed the contract yesterday. His father leaned back in his chair. Well, maybe rich people have strange hobbies. Daniel smirked. Imagine spending millions on a wedding and trusting Ethan with decorations. It's branding and event design. Ethan corrected quietly. Same thing, Daniel said. The laughter returned, but this time Ethan didn't join in. Because for the first time in years, something inside him had started changing. Not anger, not pride, just exhaustion. Exhaustion from begging people to value him. As the noise around the table continued, Ethan stared silently at his untouched food and made himself a promise. One day they would look at him differently, and by then he wouldn't need them to. The Beaumont wedding looked less like a ceremony and more like something pulled from a movie. Crystal chandeliers hung beneath a massive glass reception tent built in the middle of the Beaumont estate gardens. White roses lined marble walkways. Golden lights shimmered across fountains while a live orchestra played softly beneath the evening sky. Every detail carried Ethan's signature touch, the custom monogram projected across the dance floor. The elegant animated visuals behind the stage, the invitation designs guests kept photographing. For 6 straight weeks, Ethan had slept barely 4 hours a night bringing the event to life. And standing near the entrance watching guests admire his work should have felt rewarding. Instead, his stomach twisted with anxiety. Because his family was coming, his mother had insisted after hearing how important the wedding was. "We should support you," she'd said proudly, as though she hadn't mocked his career for years. By 7 o'clock, luxury cars filled the estate driveway. Women stepped out wearing diamond necklaces worth more than Ethan's yearly rent. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed with politicians, CEOs, and celebrities near the champagne towers. Ethan adjusted his black suit nervously. He could already hear Daniel's voice in his head. "You don't belong here." Ethan, his mother approached with his father, Daniel, and Vanessa trailing behind her. The moment they arrived, Ethan felt himself shrink back into the insecure younger son they always saw. His mother looked around in awe. "Oh my God," she whispered, "these people are unbelievably rich." Daniel smirked at Ethan. "Try not to spill anything tonight." Vanessa laughed quietly. Ethan ignored them. "Glad you made it." His father straightened his tie while examining the estate. "So this is what wedding money looks like." Before Ethan could respond, a sharply dressed older couple approached nearby guests. His mother immediately leaned closer and lowered her voice. "If anyone asks," she whispered, "tell them Ethan handles minor design support. Don't oversell things." Ethan blinked. "What?" She smiled tightly. "Honey, these people own private jets. Let's not pretend you planned this entire thing." "I did plan most of it." Daniel chuckled. "Sure you did." Then came the moment Ethan wished he could erase forever. A wealthy woman approached their group politely. "You must be family," she said warmly. His mother beamed instantly. "Yes. This is my oldest son, Daniel. He's a corporate attorney. My daughter Vanessa's husband is a surgeon." The woman nodded politely toward Ethan. "And you." Before Ethan could answer, his mother laughed softly. "Oh, Ethan is still figuring life out." The words hit harder than they should have. Still figuring life out. At 32, after years of work, after building this entire event with almost no sleep, the woman gave Ethan an awkward smile before drifting away. Daniel sipped champagne casually. "Mom, you make him sound unemployed. Aren't freelancers basically unemployed half the time?" Vanessa joked. They laughed again. Ethan stared across the glowing reception hall, trying to keep his face calm, while humiliation burned inside him. Then he noticed someone nearby watching quietly, a tall older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, Richard Beaumont. The bride's father. Ethan recognized him immediately from planning meetings. Richard said nothing, but Ethan could tell he'd overheard everything. For a moment, Ethan wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Thankfully, the ceremony began moments later. As Claire Beaumont walked down the aisle beneath thousands of white flowers, guests gasped at the beauty surrounding them. Ethan stayed near the technical control station, monitoring lighting, projections, and visual timing carefully. Everything was perfect until suddenly the screens went black, every projection vanished instantly. The music glitched, then the lighting system flickered violently. A wave of confused murmurs spread across the reception tent. "Oh no," one technician whispered. "System crash. Panic exploded around the control area. We lost the server. The backup isn't responding. The wedding presentation starts in 4 minutes." One coordinator looked ready to cry. Across the room, hundreds of wealthy guests turned toward the frozen screens. Daniel folded his arms nearby. "Oh," he muttered. "Guess the computer artist broke the wedding." His father sighed heavily. This is exactly why unstable careers are risky. Ethan ignored them completely. His brain shifted into focus. "Move," he told the technicians calmly. "What?" "Give me access." Hands flying across keyboards, Ethan traced the failure rapidly. A corrupted synchronization file had crashed the visual network connecting the lighting and display systems. Most people would panic. Ethan didn't, because this was his work, and nobody knew it better than him. Sweat rolled down his forehead as seconds disappeared. Guests were growing restless. Wedding planners whispered frantically. Then, finally, the screens flickered back to life. Soft golden lights filled the reception hall again. The orchestra resumed perfectly in sync, and the massive animated projection Ethan designed bloomed across the walls like living art. The crowd erupted into applause. Relief flooded the entire tent. Ethan stepped back, breathing hard. Then a deep voice behind him said quietly, "Interesting." Ethan turned. Richard Beaumont stood there watching him carefully. Not with pity, not with amusement, but with respect. For the rest of the evening, Ethan could feel Richard Beaumont's eyes on him. Not in the cold, dismissive way Ethan's family looked at him. This was different, measured, curious. Respectful, the wedding reception had fully recovered from the technical disaster, and now the ballroom glowed with warmth and elegance once again. Guests danced beneath floating lights, while waiters carried crystal trays through the crowd. Everywhere Ethan looked, people admired the atmosphere he had spent weeks creating. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself a tiny moment of pride. "You saved us tonight." Ethan turned to see Claire Beaumont, approaching him in her wedding gown, smiling with visible relief. "The presentation coming back when it did," she said. "That was unbelievable. I'm just glad everything worked out." "No," Claire replied firmly. "Most people would have panicked. You didn't." Before Ethan could answer, another voice joined them. "My daughter is right." Richard Beaumont stepped forward. Up close, the billionaire carried the kind of presence that made entire rooms straighten automatically. He wasn't loud or flashy like Ethan expected wealthy men to be. His confidence was calm, the dangerous kind built over decades of success. Richard extended his hand. "You handled pressure better than executives I've paid millions." Ethan shook his hand carefully, unsure what to say. "Thank you, sir." Richard glanced around the ballroom. "Do you know how many guests have asked me tonight who designed this wedding?" Ethan blinked. "Really, at least 12. Richard smiled faintly. "And those are only the people who approached me personally." Nearby, Ethan noticed his family suddenly paying very close attention. Daniel slowly lowered his champagne glass. His mother's smile became stiff. Richard continued, "The visual identity, the projection design, the atmosphere, it doesn't feel generic. Most luxury events look expensive but soulless. This feels personal." The words landed harder than Ethan expected, because nobody had ever defended his work in front of his family before. "Nobody, I appreciate that," Ethan said quietly. Richard studied him for another moment. "Walk with me." The two men moved toward a quieter corner near the garden terrace while the reception buzzed behind them. "I looked into your portfolio this afternoon," Richard said. Ethan nearly stopped walking. "You did." I make it a habit to research talented people. Richard folded his hands calmly. Your work is exceptional, but your pricing is too low. Ethan gave an awkward laugh. Clients usually think it's too high. That's because you're selling yourself like a freelancer instead of a company. The sentence hit Ethan unexpectedly hard. A company, not a struggling creative, not a disappointment. A company. Richard continued, do you know why luxury brands succeed? Marketing, confidence. Richard answered immediately. People pay for certainty, and tonight, when everything collapsed, you were the only person in the room who stayed calm. Ethan looked down briefly. Years of being treated like the least successful person in every room made compliments difficult to absorb. Richard noticed, your family doesn't value what you do very much, do they? Ethan froze. He hadn't expected the question. Before he could answer, Richard sighed lightly. I overheard enough earlier. Embarrassment crept up Ethan's neck. It's complicated. No. Richard replied calmly. It's familiar. Ethan looked at him, surprised. Richard leaned against the terrace railing. When I was young, my father thought business was foolish, said I should work at his hardware store forever. The first 5 years of my company nearly destroyed me financially. What changed? I stopped needing his approval. The words settled deep inside Ethan's chest. For years, Ethan had chased validation from people who had already decided who he was. The family failure, the weak son, the joke, and no matter how hard he worked, they protected that image because it made them comfortable. Richard reached into his jacket and handed Ethan a business card. I own Beaumont International Hospitality. I know. Richard smiled slightly. Good, then you understand the scale of what I'm about to say. Ethan's pulse quickened. We're rebranding 17 luxury properties next year across 3 countries. Richard's eyes locked onto his. And I want your company leading the visual identity project. Ethan's breathing stopped. What? The initial contract is valued at $4.8 million. The world went silent. Not 4,000, not 40,000, millions. Ethan stared at him, genuinely unable to speak. Richard continued casually, of course, my board will need presentations and formal discussions, but the offer is real. Behind them, Ethan's family had gone completely pale. Daniel looked like someone had punched him. His mother's mouth hung open slightly. Vanessa stared in disbelief. Richard noticed them watching and raised his voice just enough for nearby guests to hear. Talent deserves recognition, he said clearly. And your son is one of the most gifted designers I've seen in years. For the first time in Ethan's life, his family had nothing to say. No jokes, no sarcasm, no laughter, only silence, and somehow that silence felt sweeter than revenge itself. Access changed everything. And nothing, 3 months after the Beaumont wedding, Ethan's life barely resembled the one he used to live. His tiny apartment was gone, replaced by a modern penthouse office overlooking the city skyline. His one-man freelance business had transformed into Carter Creative Group, a fast, growing branding agency with employees, international clients, and waiting lists for consultations. Industry magazines called him the designer redefining luxury branding. The same people who once ignored his emails now competed for meetings. And every week brought another reminder that Richard Beaumont's faith in him had changed his entire future. But the strangest change wasn't financial. It was his family. Suddenly, Ethan's phone never stopped ringing. His mother began sending cheerful messages every morning. Thinking of you, sweetheart. His father proudly mentioned Ethan in conversations with neighbors. Daniel invited him to expensive restaurants. Vanessa constantly asked when he'd be free for family time. It would have felt nice once. Now it just felt obvious. One Friday evening, Ethan arrived at his parents' house for dinner after weeks of postponing invitations. The moment he walked through the front door, the energy felt completely different from the old days. His mother rushed forward smiling brightly. There's our successful son, not failure. Not confused artist, not still figuring life out. Ethan hugged her politely. The dining table looked overly prepared, almost theatrical. His favorite foods covered the table like peace offerings. Daniel poured wine with a grin. Big celebrity finally joined us. Ethan sat quietly. For most of dinner, everyone acted strangely careful around him, like they were speaking to someone important instead of family. His father cleared his throat. I saw an article about your company last week. Ethan nodded. Yeah, we launched the Singapore project. Very impressive, his father said quickly. I always knew you were creative. Ethan almost smiled at the irony. Always knew. Years of mockery flashed through his mind like old scars. Then Daniel leaned forward casually. Actually, I wanted to talk business with you. There it was. Ethan remained calm. Okay, I've been thinking about opening my own legal consulting firm. Daniel swirled his wine slowly. With your connections now, investors would probably listen. Vanessa joined immediately, and honestly, family should support family. Family. Interesting word. Ethan looked around the table quietly. Not long ago, these same people laughed while he struggled to pay rent. His mother reached across the table gently. We're proud of you, Ethan. The sentence should have healed something. Instead, it exposed something. Because deep down, Ethan realized they were proud of his success, not proud of him. There was a difference, a painful one. He set down his fork carefully. You know what's funny, he said softly. The table grew quiet. For years, I kept thinking if I worked hard enough, you'd finally respect me. Nobody spoke. Ethan looked at Daniel. When I was barely surviving, you called my career fake. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He looked toward Vanessa. You joked about me being unemployed. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Then Ethan faced his parents. And you introduced me to strangers as the son who hadn't figured life out. His mother's face fell instantly. Honey, no, Ethan interrupted gently. It's okay. And strangely enough it was. The anger that once kept him awake at night was gone. Not because he forgot, but because he no longer needed their approval badly enough to hurt. You know what Richard Beaumont told me. Ethan continued calmly. He said confidence changes everything. His father stayed silent. Ethan smiled faintly. The difference is he believed in me before I became successful. The room felt heavy. Not dramatic, not explosive, just honest. Finally, his mother whispered, we made mistakes. Yes, Ethan said softly. You did. A painful silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Ethan stood and pulled out a small envelope from his jacket. Daniel frowned. What's that? A recommendation letter. Daniel blinked for me. Ethan nodded. One of Beaumont's partners is looking for legal consultants. I already arranged an introduction. The entire table stared at him in shock. After everything, Ethan was still helping them, not because they deserved it, but because he refused to become cruel just because cruelty had shaped him. That was his real revenge. Peace. As dinner ended later that night, Ethan stepped outside into the cool evening air. Behind him, his family remained quieter than he had ever seen them. For the first time, they understood exactly what they almost lost, and for the first time in his life, Ethan walked away without feeling small. Because the boy they called a failure no longer needed anyone's permission to know his worth.